everyone. Welcome today to a fireside chat with Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez. I want to thank multiple sponsors that have made today's event possible, including the Center for Vulnerable Populations, the Chicanx and Latinx Campus Association, Department of Psychiatry, and many, many others. How this day is going to be outlined, or this afternoon will be outlined, is it's going to be a chat between me, Lisa Fortuna, and Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez. We're going to be talking for the 50 minutes that we have together, and I encourage all of you near the end. I'm going to allow at least 20 or so minutes where I'd like to get questions from you all in the audience. Okay, so I'll first introduce myself. My name is Christina Mangurian. I'm a professor and vice chair for diversity and health equity in the Department of Psychiatry. I'm so pleased to be joined by Dr. Lisa Fortuna, who's a professor and vice chair in the Department of Psychiatry and chief of psychiatry at Zuckerberg San Francisco General. And then our special guest is Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez, who's a graphic novelist and the writer and creator of the critically acclaimed and best-selling superhero series, La Borinqueña, that's actually part of the permanent collection at the Smithsonian. He also received the 2019 Bob Clampett Humanitarian Award for his philanthropic efforts via the benefit anthology Reconstruction, which he self-published to raise funds after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. In that anthology, La Borinqueña teamed up with Wonder Woman, Superman, Batman, and other DC comic heroes. And actually, it's pretty incredible. The sales of Reconstruction collected close to $250,000 and led to the development of La Borinqueña Grants Program, which supports local grassroots organizations in Puerto Rico. On top of it all, he's also an arts envoy for the U.S. State Department. And actually, I'm just going to cut and paste some information here into the chat where you can read even more about him. Actually, I'll do it afterwards because my computer is not working, but I'll do it in just a minute. Okay, so I'll set some context for how this event happened. And actually some of this speaks to the power of Twitter and social connections, remotely. So pre-COVID, I was on the social media, which I use primarily as an academic account, and I read about this Afro-Caribbean Latina superhero who happens to also study at Columbia and loves science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. As a Wonder Woman fan myself, when I saw this, I was awestruck and immediately reached out to Edgardo and said, I'd love to have him come here to UCSF, and knew that I wanted him in October of 2020, during our diversity month that we celebrate here at the university. Of course, COVID got in the way, and has for quite a bit of time. But since then, I've been so fortunate to get to partner with Dr. Lisa Fortuna, as well as Dr. Peter Uresti and the UCSF ZSFG Latinx Task Force, as well as Michelle Porsche and others to bring him here. And it's actually been even more than I could dream of, where he just gave a presentation to many of the local schools and educators here in the Bay Area. And Dr. Fortuna is working closely with him as part of Change SF to help teens develop a public service announcement to reduce mental health stigma and promote resilience. So it's just an absolute pleasure to have him here finally, and be able to talk with him and share some of his time with all of us. So the first question I have for you, Edgardo, is, not everybody was able to make the talk that you just gave. Could you briefly describe kind of your career path and your inspiration for the development of La Borinqueña?
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you everyone for being a part of this fireside chat. I thought we were gonna have a video of the Yule log burning in the background since we said fireside chat, so I'm a little kind of like missing that.
I'll try to see if I can put it in my background right now. I don't know if it's possible.
So I actually have been running my own design studio now for 20 years. So my design studio is Somos Arte. And before that, I was a teacher and grassroots activist. I've always been committed to social justice as an undergraduate student and even now as a graphic novelist. I went into the space professionally about 8 years ago of producing graphic novels for clients. And that gave me the, I guess, graduate school level training and education that I needed to feel confident enough to start publishing my own books. Although I was publishing them for established celebrities like Daryl McDaniels of Run DMC or Tony Award winning playwright John Leguizamo, I at that point was not producing my own work. And as the creative director of a design studio, often is the case, you are an artist or creative for hire. You pretty much develop other people's ideas. But it was in 2015 that at the time, Governor Padilla of Puerto Rico announced that they had surmounted an $80 billion debt on the island of Puerto Rico, more specifically the archipelago of Puerto Rico. This was a debt that was connected to the island's 123-year colonial status of the United States. As far back as the 1970s, a tax code was introduced, Tax Code 936, which provided pharmaceutical industries the economic space to develop industries on the island of Puerto Rico. And they did so for decades. It was under President Clinton's administration where the Republican Senate put pressure on his administration and duly noting that the pharmaceutical companies that were thriving in Puerto Rico were also not paying taxes. Close to $6 billion in tax revenue was lost as a result of these pharmaceutical companies. So a tax code repeal was put in place. So by 1996 through 2006, a 10-year repeal, what we started seeing was a significant decline in the economy of Puerto Rico. These pharmaceutical industries that produced everything from Viagra to aspirin were now fleeing Puerto Rico for the first time. After decades of ravaging the island's environment through a lot of toxic pollution that they were producing, the reality also was is that by the 1990s, Puerto Rico's economy was booming unlike any other period. But when the tax code was repealed, the economy started spiraling. So at the time, Puerto Rico decided to, rather specifically, the administration decided that they wanted to create an initiative to get Puerto Ricans to invest in Puerto Rico. So they said, let's sell bonds. Let's sell bonds with there are three bonus levels: no local, no state, no federal taxes on these bonds. The idea was so, I guess, ingenious that Wall Street hedge fund vultures snatched up these bonds. So the debt of Puerto Rico was now in the hands of non-Puerto Ricans. It was in the hands of Wall Street. And under President Obama's administration, they created a fiscal management board, PROMESA, the Puerto Rican Oversight Management Economic, I always forget what SA stands for, board. And it was actually under President Trump's administration when this board, the original board that was assigned by President Obama, their positions expired. So the current board that is running the fiscal management of this debt in Puerto Rico are all Trump appointees, and not one of them are Puerto Rican. Not one Puerto Rican elected official nor the governor have any say on anything that this fiscal management board decides. Right now, not even exaggerating, there is a major crisis happening in Puerto Rico because this board is trying to pass a law, well, not, you can't say law or legislation, but they're just trying to pass these measures to ensure that the holders of the debt, these Wall Street hedge funders, are going to receive $7 billion in cash instantly. And another $7 billion is going to be added to the debt. And these measures are being introduced in the context of austerity, right? So that there is going to be a decline in pensions that have already been assigned to teachers, but also police officers, to the extent then now the police department of Puerto Rico has said we are on strike. It's never happened in the history of anything across the United States. So the police department of Puerto Rico officially is going on strike today through Monday, and they will not be back on duty until there is a resolution that they are in accordance with. But this is happening all across Puerto Rico. The tuition in the public universities are going up. There's and for the first time in the history of Puerto Rico, and according to the U.S. Census Bureau that was recently revealed in 2020, the Puerto Rican population between 2010, which was just trickling off that tax repeal of 2006, by 2020 had decreased by 500,000. 500,000. Right now, Puerto Rico has a population of 3 million Puerto Ricans with U.S. citizenship. Right now, Puerto Rico is probably like 22nd in the United States in terms of population, meaning that there are 21 other states that have a smaller population than Puerto Rico. And so these austerity measures really inspired me to create this comic book series back in 2016, because I wanted to have a discourse similar to what we're having now. And I wanted to enter into the space of popular culture. And I aggressively was like thinking, I need to create a project that will get me in front of a CNN or ABC or NBC or Fox, and they'll be attracted by the character. They'll say, "Ooh, look how colorful,
Totally.
pretty colors." And once they brought me in front of the camera, I could actually talk about these austerity measures. I could talk about how this has led to a major humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico. And that's really what inspired me to make the book. So I created a narrative that was inspired by a lot of history, a lot of social, political, economic, environmental issues. I study a lot of historical texts. I read a lot of articles. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I try my best to stay aware of what's happening in Puerto Rico. And although there's a constant debate, left or right, in terms of what the political status of Puerto Rico should be it be a state? Should it be an independent nation? Should it be a more modified commonwealth? The reality is right now we're dealing with 3 million US citizens who are being treated as second-class citizens. So I created La Borinqueña to engage into these discourses to address this human rights issue. Because it's something that's specific to brown folks. It's something that's specific to us as people. And that's why I created La Borinqueña.
Yeah. And that's just so critical. And I'm wondering, like, you know that this is a health sciences university. And so a lot of the people who are maybe watching this are providers for patients or work in some way, or trainees or students. And I think one of the interesting things that you've used La Borinqueña for as well, as I mentioned, she's, interested in STEM. She was a Columbia student, but also something that I'd forgotten about before I saw you give the presentation was she had asthma. And maybe you could talk to the group about the decision that you made to have her have asthma, and then also a little bit about the work that you've been doing in promoting wearing masks and vaccinations, because I know that the audience would really be interested in that.
So across the United States, mostly you'll find in communities of color, which oftentimes tend to be working class, poor communities, most economically hit communities, there tend to be the most environmentally related health issues. And one of those health issues is asthma. Puerto Rico has one of the highest rates of asthma. The South Bronx has one of the highest rates of asthma, and on and on and on and on and on across the United States. So the character, although she's fictional and she gets these superhuman abilities, she still has asthma. When she gets her superpower, she doesn't lose her asthma. Because it would be very dismissive and remiss of me to actually create a character like, oh, she was sick, but look, now she's better now because she has these powers. And the work that we do during the pandemic was something that was specific to the lack of PPE, particularly across the United States in communities of color and tribal nations and Puerto Rico. So we created this project called Masks for America, which raised millions of dollars so that we could actually purchase KN95 masks and N95 masks. We're one of the first groups that created an account with 3M because everyone was on queue. Even states were on queue to receive masks from 3M. And we managed to figure out a way to get on a higher queue and states started buying masks from us because we were able to finagle through the red tape to buy these masks, and we distribute them across the U.S. to tribal nations, communities of color, healthcare workers on the front line in Puerto Rico. And the work that we're doing with our La Borinqueña grants program, due to the success of the sales of our books, supports organizations that are committed to this work in Puerto Rico. And one of the things that's important to understand, particularly in the areas of health, is not just physical health, but mental health. Hurricane Maria left Puerto Rico with 4,645 deaths. 150,000 Puerto Ricanos were displaced, relocated by FEMA across the United States. 800,000 homes were decimated. The island itself, on a whole, was without electricity for 11 months. The level of PTSD that people still to this day are dealing with as a result of Hurricane Maria, who are now also living across the United States, because as I shared, when the census data was reviewed for 2020, Puerto Rico's population decreased by 500,000, which means that the United States population of Puerto Ricans increased by 500,000, and they're across the United States, and they're not just coming here to fill the workforce or fill the areas of any professional industry. They're also coming in with their mental health issues because they're survivors of a cataclysmic storm. They're survivors of losing their home, losing everything. So you have a population within that 500,000 that consists of professional engineers, scientists, chemists that lost their careers because of the repeal of the tax code 936 that led to the dissolution of many pharmaceutical companies. But then you also have hundreds of thousands that were displaced because of Hurricane Maria. So you had two crises that created a whole new population of people with mental health issues due to in this brief span of a few years. And we happen to have been creating La Borinqueña right around this period. And I can tell you, as a 51-year-old man of Puerto Rican heritage, never in my life have I ever seen Puerto Rico trend as much as it has in the last 5 years. And it's just been something fortunate that we've been able to do our little part by creating this project to open this dialogue into mainstream spaces. And that's a whole other conversation, because mainstream narratives, and even the word mainstream in its origin, in my opinion, personally, is racist. Because when you say mainstream, you're saying white, male, hetero. And when you go to the Barnes and Noble, you go to the bookstores, you got to go to the Black section to find, or the urban section to find books around people of African descent, or the Spanish language section to find anything related to Latinx identity. And everything is so marginalized that I think that this is what I was trying to steer through in creating this project, because I wanted to bring La Borinqueña to a mainstream audience, and it's been a journey. It's had its challenges, but it's something that we're committed to, and that's why we've been reviewed by the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN. That's why we're celebrated by the Smithsonian Museum, who includes us in their permanent collection, and not just one museum, various museums. They're going to be opening up in 22 the first Latino institute at the Smithsonian, and we're part of that exhibition. But it's also important to understand.
Congratulations.
But it's also important to understand that we're doing all of this as an independently published project with no major corporate backing, with no major corporate promotion, with no major corporate sponsorship. This is something that we're passionate about, that we believe in, and we use the tools, use the resources, use the skills and the talents that we have to produce these books, but also to engage into these very necessary conversations. You know, we're in a space that, as a studio that's run by two people of color, myself being Puerto Rican, my wife being Korean American, we are also aware that we just can't produce for the sake of producing. We just can't produce for the sake of like, oh, let's just make all this money and buy ourselves a beautiful condo. It's more like we need to use our platform to raise awareness and also to channel a form of philanthropy that's never been done before. Oftentimes, philanthropy is associated with billionaires. And the reality is that billionaires are being philanthropic because there's a PR agency that they have on retainer that says, clean up your image. You look a little too greedy. So maybe you should give some money away. And then all of a sudden, oh my God, oh my goodness, the Gates Foundation is so generous, and oh my gosh, right? But the reality is, this is an initiative of a PR company. We're coming from a place where by no means we are economically wealthy or on that level, but we see the need of doing these initiatives. So if I team up with DC Comics, which is a subsidiary of Warner Brothers, then I'm going to use that partnership to bring hundreds of thousands of dollars to Puerto Rico. If I team up with this chocolate company that's been producing chocolate in Puerto Rico for over 100 years, I'm going to also figure out a way to put money back into the programs that are necessary for children. And next year, we're teaming up with the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is one of the largest institutions that devoted to environmental justice here in the United States, founded by Robert Redford and many other amazing people. We're teaming up with them because we see the need to address climate change in a mainstream, larger conversation. It's not just, even though a German consortium of scientists under the name of German Watch did this 10-year study, and page after page after page, everything points to Puerto Rico as like the ground zero for where the most climate change is going to be witnessed. And we have seen it in the last 5 years. We saw Hurricane Maria. We saw a series, even though we lived through a pandemic globally, just before the pandemic hit, there was a series of earth-shattering earthquakes that hit the southern coast of Puerto Rico, leaving tens of thousands of people without homes and many lives lost. So what we're trying to do is trying to find a way to bring these conversations to specific audiences, and seeing how this is something that we'll have an opportunity and a responsibility to be a part of, because this is a humanitarian issue. This is not just a Latin issue. This is not just a person of color issue. This is a human issue.
Totally. And I think that really speaks, there's just a huge dedication to this at UCSF as well. And I kind of am wanting to build upon the thread that you were talking about before around mental health issues. And I'm hoping that maybe you and Lisa could talk a little bit about the partnership that you both have created and why you're both interested in doing this to work with Change SF and build these public service announcements for youth. Just given kind of, I'm thinking the impact of COVID, a climate crisis, social discord upon youth. So maybe Lisa, do you want to maybe describe it a little bit first, and then Edgardo, it would be great to say why you were interested in partnering with us to do this work.
Okay, great. Thank you, Christina. So first, I didn't show Edgardo this before, but I have the Borinqueña coffee mug on my desk, which was gifted to me. And I present that because in reality, throughout this pandemic and everything that's been happening around at least our discourse that I'm hoping will be sustained for change around racial inequities and injustices, as a Boricua, as a Puerto Rican woman, this sort of having this Borinqueña on my desk kind of reminds me of sort of that sort of leaning into sort of my own heritage and culture and African heritage identity, right? So when I start thinking about that, and seeing the things that the kids, young people and families are experiencing disproportionate impact of COVID-19, and both, from a mental health, economic, physical death, and many, many other things that have impacted the Latino community and communities of color during the pandemic. We thought, that it would be really important to figure out a way to look at messaging, resilience and healing through the use of the arts, or in the imagery of what the La Borinqueña represents, right? Which is really around sort of, being a superhero, but being a superhero for justice, for healing, for, the Borinqueña has been such an important voice around voting rights and Black Lives Matter. And, so we thought, it would be fantastic to partner and see if we could create a message around mental health, resilience and racial justice for our community. And when I walk around sort of also like the Mission District where San Francisco General Hospital is, I can see that the arts, and the murals and all the vibrancy that we have here in the city, a lot of expressions of people's experience of the pandemic, and leaning into culture for our healing and well-being, I thought it would be a wonderful way. So what we've done is partner up with the San Francisco Hospital Foundation, granted us a grant, a Hearts grant, to be able to do this work in collaboration with Edgardo, bringing him to talk to the schools, which he did this morning, and then also partnering up with another program that Marina Toulouse-Shams and Michelle Porsche, are involved in leading, along with Nicole Elmore, with this program that we have called Change SF. And Change SF is Community Health Advanced by Next Generation Efforts in San Francisco. And what that's going to be is a group of young people who are going to be interning, mostly virtual for the current pandemic issues, but at San Francisco General Hospital and UCSF in several projects around learning about mental health. And part of the project that we would love them to be is mental health ambassadors. And so working together with Edgardo and our program in creating a public service announcement around mental health, racial equity, and resilience. And the young people will be involved in creating that messaging together with the imagery of La Borinqueña as a voice for that as well. So I'll leave it there. So we're really excited to partner on that.
It's something that we're always committed to, is to use the work and the image of La Borinqueña and associate it with campaigns that are committed to truly engaging audiences for social change, for social justice, truly address inequities that exist. And that's one of the ways we're able to do it, because one of the reasons why we're able to do it, rather, is because La Borinqueña is an independently published project. We don't appropriate narratives for social justice so that we can sell you pajamas for roll-ups and fulfill the economic needs of multi-billionaires who own these corporations. We are a grassroots publishing company and studio that are still committed and still directly involved and engaged in this work. And being able to partner with Lisa and everyone else to develop this campaign, particularly with young people, gives these children the voice and the platform that affirms their heroism, that affirms their courage, that affirms their resilience. And as we're trying to find a semblance of normalcy in our society right now through this pandemic, because we're still living through this pandemic right now, it's important to understand that children are the ones that are the most affected, because they don't have any prior context of normalcy. If they're literally growing up through this reality and having to experience school through their devices, or having to engage with one another behind masks, it's becoming a mental health issue that we're not going to see the full ramifications of for possibly a decade from now or longer. The long-term effect that is going to be driven home, literally, is something that will stay with these children for many years. This is something that we're still living through, and it's still evolving, and unfortunately in our nation has been politicized, which is an incredible unfortunate event. I have to point out that in Puerto Rico right now, you have the highest rate of vaccinated people anywhere in the United States. And that is because Puerto Rico never politicized the vaccine. They never politicized the pandemic, the virus. They didn't. They just didn't. So whether you were blue, whether you were red, whether you were purple, whether you were polka dot, everyone got online to receive their shots. I remember I traveled to Puerto Rico with my family for the last month and a half of the spring into the summer this year. And many people are asking, oh my gosh, are you going to be okay? And I tell them, I feel safer in Puerto Rico than I do in Brooklyn, New York, because their adherence to the CDC guidelines were on point. And this is something that I witnessed then. So to see like CNN and NBC and all these major news outlets, and this last week, and the New York Times literally just published an article this week about it, to see them talking about the rates of vaccinated population in Puerto Rico compared to anywhere in the United States, I saw it. I saw it with my own eyes. So this is something, this project, this initiative is going to be important, and I hope that even though it's going to have a message that's developed locally, I strongly believe that it's going to have a national impact with the work that this collaboration is going to produce.
Yeah, I do too, and I'm in some many ways hopeful about the kind of issues of mental health, which touch so many different populations, that I think while so much has been politicized and polarized, I think there's a lot of shared understanding of the mental health impact of the pandemic. And I think I'll just share kind of a link for some of those on the phone. The Senate actually has a bipartisan committee that's really trying to be thinking about this, because I think that they've been really know that we have a lot of room to grow in this space in reducing mental health stigma and improving mental health services. And I couldn't agree with you more, Edgardo, especially for youth, which it is going to be a while before we see kind of the impact. So it's important to do this work early. As I mentioned before, I did want to take some questions from the audience. So if folks want to ask questions in here, please ask. I'd asked before if folks wanted to share other examples of using art to promote social justice, but if anybody has any questions, you can put it on the chat here, and I'm happy to read them off if you have them. Maybe while we're waiting, Edgardo, do you want to tell us something that you mentioned in the other meeting, but I don't believe you mentioned now, though I was distracted for a bit trying to get a fireplace behind myself when we were talking. You could tell about your inspiration with your own mentorship. Could you tell them who kind of some of your people who have helped you along the way are?
So I've been mentored by very incredibly powerful women, starting from my own mother as a single mother to my aunt, who is a leading educator as part of this organization called Narrative 4. And my other mentors are attorney Iris Morales, who's one of the original members of the Young Lords Party, and was very involved in the civil rights movement here in the United States, particularly from the perspective of the Latin communities. And Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, who is one of the leading voices for the African diaspora internationally of Puerto Rican heritage. These women have shaped me to be the man that I am, and have helped me understand that I have male privilege, I have light skin privilege, and I use that to navigate these spaces to try to empower my voice, but also empower those who oftentimes are left behind. So although I am the voice and the writer and the creator of this character, under the work that we do in our studio, we do our best to recruit more women into our projects. Our grants program is actually run by my partner, Edgardo Miranda, and she was the visionary who came up with this idea of creating a nonprofit organization that was dedicated to funneling resources, oftentimes specific to the U.S., and bringing them to Puerto Rico. And the majority of, real talk, all the organizations that we support are run by women. So all of this, and that's just the reality of the work that I see. And when it comes to the grassroots work, when it comes to the work that's dedicated to social justice, there is an overwhelming feminist presence there, and that's what continues to inspire me to do the work that I do with Borinqueña.
Excellent, excellent. So then we do have a question from somebody. I think that Dr. Glowinski, do you want to take yourself off mute? I'm not sure if you're able. Are you not able to? Let's see. Nicholas, you can, there.
Oh, just a moment. She should be able to unmute herself now.
Okay, I'm so sorry. So first of all, Edgardo, I want you to know that there is possibly nothing more exciting for me than having a graphic artist talking about collaboration with mental health professionals. I come from France. There is a very, very big comic book culture in Europe, you probably know.
Yeah.
And so when I go to meetings in Europe, my specialty for a long time was depression and suicidality in young people. And so there are initiatives to talk about suicide and to talk about suicide prevention using very beautiful comic books. So I've definitely seen that. There's also a wonderful artist called Hélène Fournet. I don't know if you know her, but she talked about her own experience of having bipolar disorder in a really beautiful book called Marbles. But I love your heroine, and I love that she has asthma. I love that she's a woman, a nerd. I love that not a nerd in a bad way, but sort of like,
I know, I know what you mean.
and of course I love her background, her ethnic background. So one question I have for everybody in the panel is, can we talk a little bit more about the link between justice, because we're talking about that, right, when we're talking about health disparity, the link between justice and mental health, period. So not just the idea that you have mental health problems and there's disparity, but also that the injustice is a direct risk factor.
Yeah, Lisa, do you want to go first, and then I'll?
Yeah. I can start a little bit. I mean, yeah, I think that's one of the things that inspired me to think about this from a social justice perspective and looking at mental health. I mean, what we know, at least in research, and the research that some research that I've done as well, is the importance of identity as a potential buffering place, right, for mental health, especially when one is experiencing discrimination and disparities. And so what I think a lot of the young people that are experiencing here, we're looking at sort of direct crisis, right, of a pandemic and trauma and adversity and loss, right, throughout this pandemic, compounded by a lot of assaults, right, on one's identity through discrimination. And so that combination, we know, can be very challenging for young people, right? Sort of adversity and discrimination and experiences of racism, as well as witnessing violence against people of color, right? Which was also sort of exacerbated during this time that we've been in this pandemic, syndemic, as we're calling it. And what a lot of research shows is that when young people are able to sort of have a strong sense of racial identity and cultural identity, that can be a buffer for, at least not having that racial trauma sort of compound the risk for mental health issues, right? And also we know that sort of the expression of identity and finding community in that, and finding ourselves reflected in the greater society can be can help our mental health. So that's part of some of the reasons that I thought having an imagery like Borinqueña as one image of leaning into who we are, right, and our history and our heritage as a place of resilience and strength.
I agree with what you said, Lisa. First of all, thank you for teaching me the word syndemic. I just looked it up, so now I feel so much smarter than I did 2 seconds ago. It's important that identity is an issue that we speak about, particularly when you're discussing mental health, particularly when you're looking at the mental health of young people of color in our country. We live in a society that has obviously deep-rooted systemic racist issues. And the whole idea of having a young person of color see themselves and feel affirmed, well, it's the antithesis of what young white people experience. They navigate through our country with white privilege. They navigate through our country with a sense of position, with a sense of belonging. When you're a person of color, of Asian, of Latin, of African, of Native, or even indigenous to this country, you're constantly bombarded with imagery, with messages that are saying, you don't belong here. You're not American. This is not your country. Go back to where you came from. That is something that at its core, psychologically, breaks us apart. So the work that we do in La Borinqueña is very aware of that. So by teaching young people about Puerto Rican history, right, as a microcosmic experience, or an example rather, what we're actually saying is learn about your history, learn about your heritage, draw strength from your roots, draw strength from that background so that you can blossom, so that you can grow. You can only be as strong as the foundation that you come from. And that's what this project is truly about. And also by creating a character that is of African descent, well, she actually has an even broader appeal. She's not just seen as a Puerto Rican character. She's not just seen as a Caribbean character. She's seen as a character that's part of this African diaspora, and I've experienced it firsthand. I've been at events where it's been the audience consists of other comic book producers of African descent. Black Comic Book Festival, for example, that happens here in Harlem in New York City every year around Martin Luther King weekend. Overwhelmingly, families come to the table and they see a Black hero. They see a Black woman, and I tell them, yeah, you're right, she is Black. I'm not gonna tell them, oh no, she's Puerto Rican. No, come on, she's Black. So there is some empowerment that comes from that, and you can't have this conversation without understanding what significant impact the work is doing simply by the pigment that's chosen to color her face.
Right. And I agree with everything that Lisa and Edgardo have said. And I'll just say that, plenty of evidence showing that discrimination, harassment, and violence have adverse mental health impacts across the lifespan. These as children grow up, become older, and then even the microaggressions, it's like what Edgardo was saying, that kind of picking up within the climate that you're less than. And I think our role as clinicians is, not only to have a trauma-informed care lens, but also to kind of find with our patients, no matter, and also using obviously cultural humility, but working with our patients to find out, what do they feel like their strengths are, and their strengths within their communities, and sometimes in traditional psychiatric training, we don't think about faith-based settings, which happen to be very important. Whether I'm Latina, my mother's, and I am Catholic, that happens to be an important part of my family's identity, but people in psychiatry specifically in our training, sometimes we're taught to move away from thinking about those kinds of things as being part of the treatment, but they actually, finding however many ways a community can wrap around an individual are critical in empowering people. Other questions?
We're almost out of time.
I know we are, but I still think there's enough time for a couple.
It goes fast. Yeah. I mean, I can comment briefly on this idea of syndemic, right? I mean, I think a lot of us have heard that through this pandemic, and if you actually look at the definition, as Edgardo did very quickly, it really is. Syndemics are characterized by biological and social interactions between conditions and states, interactions that increase a person's susceptibility to harm or worsen their health outcomes. And we know that we've talked a lot about that in terms of the COVID pandemic and the racial violence and discrimination escalations, right, that we've been having throughout the last couple of years. Always been there, that part, right? But sort of that sort of, combination and escalation of things. And so I think, for me, the way to sort of lean into buffering that is leaning into sort of what Anne talks about. She loves the intersectionality, right, of La Borinqueña, right, that she has asthma, that she does have a health condition that she manages, as well as her ethnicity, her culture, her gender, her Black identity. To me, sort of when we look at these interactions with biological risk, we have to look at the interactions and this intersectionality of potentials for strength, right? And I think that that's really what the Borinqueña brings in all of her, intersecting identities and experiences. And it sort of gives a message to kids that we can look at ourselves that way too, right?
Right.
Yeah, and see people that look like you. I'm even thinking of Sonia Sotomayor, right, telling her story, seeing a Supreme Court justice, who'd had diabetes, right? And so, that's what I think is so lovely about her having, asthma. I can't remember, Edgardo, are there any times that she kind of struggles with any mental health issues? Or
in the actual, yes, she actually does. In the second book, she's literally going through kind of like an existential crisis because she's living through this reality of now being another person. When she's in costume, she automatically has these abilities, and she's named by her by people in Puerto Rico. They call her La Borinqueña. She always calls herself Marisol. She introduces herself to people as Marisol, but people call her La Borinqueña because they see her as a living embodiment of nationalism in Puerto Rico, right? And it's in the second book where she's like, am I Marisol anymore, or have I just become this character? And I've had talks where I bring this up because many of us live in this duality. We're this person in at work, in front of our students, in front of our colleagues, and we're completely another person at home. And sometimes we have to kind of like come to terms with, like, am I still the same person, or do I turn on this kind of like guise just because I'm in front of an audience? And I think it was important to have this in the story, because as a young person navigating this kind of higher learning experience, and this is coming from the perspective that I also was very drawn to make the character study abroad. And it wasn't just like, oh, she's at Columbia, so she's gonna take classes in Pennsylvania, or she's gonna go to UCSF. No, I transplanted her to Puerto Rico, and by transplanting her to Puerto Rico, she's faced with the reality of the socio-economic, environmental issues affecting other Puerto Ricans her own age, and she's going through this kind of identity crisis. Like, who am I? Am I becoming her? Am I somebody else now, or am I just evolving to another version of myself? And I feel that this oftentimes is a challenge that many young people go through when they do have the opportunity to study abroad. And particularly as a young person of color, and I've spoken to so many young people of color who have the opportunity to study at prestigious universities, and they feel almost as if they're sellouts.
Yeah.
As if they're like I grew up around so many like black and brown people, and now I'm at the school and I'm the only anything in these classrooms and on this campus, and I feel like I've become somebody else. My vernacular has changed, my interests and my passions have changed, and it's important to understand and reflect that we could support this. We could encourage these young people to not give up. And I'm having this very same conversation with my son, who's about to embark on college next year. And he started having these conversations early on when he was enrolled in his high school. He's in a very prestigious and academically rigorous public high school in New York City. But even though the public high school, the high school itself, the district has been gerrymandered to literally have the richest white people in the school. And when he was in the school, he was like, Dad, I'm like one of the only like people of color in this school. What the hell? And I told him, I was like, look, this is a space that you're going to have to learn how to navigate. And it's important you navigate this now as a high school student, because college is going to be the same way. But you know what? Society is going to be the same way. And you just have to remember who you are, remember what you've learned about yourself. And that's what's going to steer you through this storm of people that may challenge you and challenge who you are, or even challenge you for even physically being in this space.
Right. And that continues on, right? There's so many of my colleagues who are the only, right, person of color or woman in the room that, you know, or woman of color in the room as you keep kind of moving up. So kind of leaning into the, you know, the strength in which we're.
And it's also the burden. It's the burden of being the only. The only automatically, you have to be, not only are you now the only, you have the burden of being the expert.
The representative of everybody.
We're about to introduce this study that we just picked up. Christina, totally. What do you think? What do you think is the Latin perspective on this? And you're like, what? Why me? I'm just like you guys. I'm in the same room. It makes you think I have any more insight just because I'm a little browner. So it's like it's the burden of that, you know. And I think that's also like the burden of me publishing La Borinqueña. It's oftentimes like I don't have this freedom to just be like, I'm just gonna make this comic book and sell the property to a studio so I can become a billionaire. No, it's more like I created this project. It's named after Puerto Rico, connected to Puerto Rico, and it has to be around social justice and it has to be around philanthropy. That's the burden that I'm aware of, and that's the burden that I embrace with the work that I do with La Borinqueña.
And we're so happy that you have. And I'm going to end us. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time. You were phenomenal. I'll highlight Ricardo shared a resource that I think you'd like, Edgardo, that's using
Yeah, I just linked on it now.
Yes, and so it's not the same as La Borinqueña, but it's at least has some accessibility with for youth. And I'm just grateful for everybody who was here. This was taped, so you can Nicholas will probably be making it available on our website as well. And well, maybe we'll all give some virtual claps to Edgardo for being here and Lisa for being here with us
Thank you
today.
for inviting me.
Thank you so much for being here. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.